The Perfect Gold by Keith P. Graham. Lee Greco stood at the door of the workshop, looking down the path towards the road. The chill October winds cut through her thin clothes. There was no sign of the doctor. The doctor would not come so far out of his way to such a poor farm. With or without the aid of expensive medicines, her father would surely die soon. Lee's father was lying on a cot in his workshop. A stroke had sliced through his brain, cutting him off from her. He could not walk or even talk, and he choked when he tried to swallow. Only his eyes seemed to have some life left, but the language they spoke was of fear and pain. Lee spent long hours trying to get a few spoonfuls of soup into him. She could not move him. It was all she could do to get him up off the floor where he had fallen and onto a cot. The low stone chimney of her father's workshop was cold now. She could not remember a day in her life that a warm gray smoke had not drifted over the little valley. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the thing her mother had taught her. There were herbs that might ease him. "I don't have what he needs here," she said to herself. She had to walk down to the river and gather herbs, a hike of about 9 miles each way. She had to leave her father alone for many hours, and he might die. He was already dehydrated, and the strain on his heart might kill him. She knew what she had to do. Lee went into the main house and found her mother's spell bag. It was made of green velvet and contained small jars of all the things that a wise woman might need. There was also a silver dagger and a tiny Bible. Lee tore a page from the Bible, folded it in half, and put a pinch of gray powder from one of the jars in it. She then put 3 pinches of yellow flowers of sulfur into the fold of the paper and mixed it up with the point of the dagger. She folded up the paper into a small square package and put it in the pocket in her dress. Lee went to her father's workshop. It was cold and dark. She piled up billets of oak in the wide fireplace that her father used for making glass. She placed the package in the fireplace under the piled wood and lit it with one of the long matches from an old coffee can. The package smoked for a moment as the paper burned low, and then, with a fizzing sound, the powder caught fire, shooting green sparks out sideways. The dark green smoke smelled of brimstone. The fire got brighter and brighter, illuminating the dark workroom with an emerald green light. Her father's eyes glowed as he watched from his cot. "I have to go, Father," she said to him. "I have to fetch some medicine, so I'll have to leave you alone. I'm fixing it, so you will be safe. You'll be fed and cleaned while I am away. It will only be but a day." The fire did not die down, and the green flames spread in glowing spider webs over the oak. The room began to warm up with that cozy, radiated heat that only an open fire can produce. Lee kneeled down in front of the fire, sitting on her haunches, and raised her hands to the flames. They reached out and warmed her without burning. They swirled around her, and she felt the green flow giving her strange strength as she breathed it in. Lee's mother had taught her that the world was full of powers. Great powers that walked with 7-league boots and tiny powers made by eddies in the flow of energies. The elementals left wakes in the world where they passed, but the tiny swirls and whirlpools of mystical power had little lives of their own. The old people of the Ohio Appalachians called them fairies or pixies, or the little people. They were not people as such, but tiny sparks of supernatural life that flowed from place to place, attracted by warmth and human souls, but always wary and shy. The little people could be called upon with the right thoughts. They could be bargained with and coaxed and bribed, and they loved the green fire. Bright red and golden sparks came down the chimney and through the open door. They swirled around the fire, dipping in and out of the flames. They swirled around Lee's hair, making it rise with static electricity. They knew Lee and loved her. She had fed them with warm milk and sulfur. She had called on them to help her paint the house with the bright colors that they loved, and on summer evenings with the heat lightning crackling in the sky, she had told them all of her secret thoughts and dreams. Now they read her thoughts, and the glowing sparks pulsed with different colors at her sorrow. She explained her father's sickness, and they swirled around him, glowing in dark purples and reds. They pulled the covers up close around his neck and winked in his eyes, as the old man could only watch them in silent wonderment. She explained that she had to leave. She pleaded with them to feed him, and clean him, and protect him. The little people cried glowing hot pink tears and reassured her. They would be here until she got back. Lee thanked them, with sincere tears of her own, which the little sparks caught before they hit the floor, and dried them in the fire. Lee filled the wheelbarrow with split billets and brought them right into the workshop, next to the fire, so that the little people could keep the fire going and her father warm. She pushed it as close as she could to the hearth, moving the wrought iron tongs and barrels filled with clean sand and bone ash aside. Her father would not be making glass again, and would not need the tools of his trade anymore. She hung an old sepia picture of her mother on the wall where her father could see it. In the picture, her mother's hair was a pale brown, but in her mind's eye Lee could see it was a rich golden blonde. Lee's father, Michael Grieco, had come to Guernsey County, Ohio for the sand. The sand under a foot or so of loam was clean and fine here, just right for glass. He was a glassmaker in the Venetian tradition. Her father had started an apprenticeship 50 ago in his native Venice, but he fled to America before he was established in his home city. He never gave the reason, although Lee suspected that her father, a passionate man, had been in trouble over a woman. Lee's father said that he had come from Italy in search of the perfect gold. All yellow glass has a touch of green or a hint of red. The metallic additives used to make yellow did not produce a pure color. They were either too pale or had some other color mixed with them. He had read that a medieval monk had made the perfect gold, but the secret recipe had died with him. Her father had come close to the perfect gold, but had never been satisfied. Although he had produced deep blues and emerald greens that were the envy of every glassmaker who had seen them, he always had returned to his search for the perfect gold. Michael Grieco married Esther Taylor, a healer or wise woman, as the locals sometimes called her. They sometimes named her Witch. She had set a break in his leg that happened when a large stone had fallen from its place in the chimney he was building. It was a break that would have meant death to most men, or a lost leg to some, but Esther had healed him. Lee was their only daughter. Esther had loved the child Lee, and tried to make her life happy and as normal as she could, but Esther had died young of a wasting illness when Lee was 10. Lee, now in her 20s, was a dark-haired, half-Italian woman. She, like her mother, was named Witch by her neighbors. Her dark complexion and odd way of speaking set her apart from them. No boys came a-courting, but occasionally a neighbor came to buy the small charms and spells she made to protect the milk from souring or to keep a child from dying in her crib. Her mother had taught her much of the secret ways of a wise woman. She could call a storm or find water for a well. She could heal a cow sick with murrain and set a broken bone. Lee also knew darker things about the powers that walked the forests. She could throw out a devil or calm an elemental if the need arose. She could not, however, cure a stroke or prevent an inevitable death. Lee went into the main house and put some bits of dried food into a bag with a jar of water. She took out across the fields towards the river. There was swampy land there, where she could get the bark of the willow and maybe even the flowers of the meadowsweet, although it was much too late in the season. It was late that night when Lee finally got back home. She could see the green glow in the windows of the workshop through the pine trees from a mile away as she came over the top of the ridge. The little people were still there, keeping the fire going and taking care of her father. She knew that if the fire had gone out, it would have been a sign that her father was dead. The tiny glowing sparks swarmed around her in greeting as she entered the room. Her father was propped up on pillows, halfway sitting up. He had a fresh flannel shirt on. One side of his face was slack and dead, but the other was wrinkled and pulled up in a half smile. He tried to talk, but only a short grunting sound came out. He was smiling, Lee thought, and she smiled back. The little people had taken good care of him, and he was obviously feeling better and glad to see her. Lee laughed, and the light from the little people caught the glow of her smile, and the room visibly brightened. "I found some willows and took a good bit of bark," she said. "I'll make you a tea from the bark. Mostly you will be needing rest, but the tea should help. Mother told me once, willow tea and thyme can help some of the effects of a stroke." Her father grunted, and she knew that if he had trouble talking, he might have equal trouble in understanding. Lee smiled at him and gave him a kiss on the cheek. A kiss, she knew, he could find easy to understand. Her father moved his mouth, but no sounds came. Lee nodded as though to say, "I understand, Daddy." As she turned to straighten the covers a little, she noticed a pile of glass on the hearth. There were blobs of newly made melted glass forming webs of color and shapeless whirls. The little people must have read her father's desires and tried to make some glass for him. She touched the piece, it was still warm. She knew that some educated people valued abstract art, and that this was as abstract as anything that she had ever heard of, but it was also, most certainly, art. It was beautiful, full of little details of swirling and shifting color. It reminded her of the way lamp oil looked when dripped in a puddle as it shifted and whirled in tiny currents. "This is nice, Father," she said. "I think I'll take it into the house and hang it on the wall." Her father grunted, and she couldn't tell that the practical old man agreed or disagreed with her. Lee slept in the main house. She was exhausted from the long walk to the river and back. As she drifted off to sleep, she saw a small spark out of the corner of her eye. One of the little people was looking in on her. The next morning, the coals in the hearth were low, and her father was asleep on the cot. She tried to wake him, but he wouldn't open his eyes. His breathing was shallow and quiet. Lee pulled the blanket up around his neck and put a few logs on the fire. She looked at her father. He had once been a giant bear of a man with powerful arms, strengthened from pulling on the bellows, but now he was thin and weak. I broke her heart to see him wasting away. Lee spent the day trying to get some tea or broth down her father's throat without choking him. He never quite woke up, but once or twice he opened his eyes and breathed heavier. His eyes were focused on something in the far distance, and he didn't seem aware of her. Finally, he drifted off into a deeper sleep. His breath came in full drafts, and his color became a little less pale. That night, when the fire had gone out and the little people had all wandered off to follow their Quicksilver interests, Lee started a fire, this time the normal way. After a bit of smoky hesitation, the fire burned bright. She sat next to her father, staring into the dancing flames. The little workshop was tightly built, and soon it was quite warm. Her father snorted in his sleep, but still did not wake. Lee remembered the good times before her mother had sickened, and she drifted off to sleep dreaming of summer days of joy. Briefly, she was a little girl again, being carried in her father's arms. She awoke in the night. The room glowed a deep red from the light of the large oak coals. Next to the fire, the handmade bellows were slowly opening and closing, as if by the action of unseen muscles. There were tiny sparks of light, as if someone had poked the fire, swirling around the room. They formed a twinkling crown around her father's head, and as she watched, they surrounded a glowing red glob that rested in the hottest part of the fire. The little people pulled on the glob of molten glass, forming it, twisting it, and working into a strange shape. Smaller globs from other parts of the fire lifted and joined the larger mass, and more sparks joined in the creation process. As Lee watched, the shape began to take form. It looked like someone. She could see a nose and eyes forming. Even though the glass was glowing in deep reds and oranges, she could see that the eyes were blue and the cheeks a rich pink. The chin was sharp. Lee gasped as she recognized the face of her mother, dead these last 15 years. She looked at her father. His eyes were open, and he was watching the glass intently. The little people moved over the glass as though they were the tools of his thoughts. She could see one of his hands trembling as he tried to move it. The glass formed and grew. The shape flattened into a dish, and then pushed out into full relief. Lee could see that it was the perfect image of her mother smiling. Her mother's eyes looked directly into her father's eyes. They looked alive, and the small flames that flared in time with the bellows made them dance as though in great joy. As the portrait grew, another large ball of molten glass joined it and spread itself slowly out of the head. It was a glowing gold, like a daisy's eye or the summer afternoon sun. It was the perfect gold, the color of her mother's hair. Lee now understood that her father's quest for the perfect gold had been won and then lost in her mother. He had found the color, not in his glass, but in his one true love. He had lost that true love 15 years before, and now in his last act had discovered the perfect golden color once again. Her father's breathing became rough and labored. Lee could see that he was trying to rise up and go to the image of his lover. The sparks danced around him faster and faster, and the portrait smiled even more. In the shimmering air around the fire, Lee thought that she could read the lips. "Come," they seemed to say, "come to me." The twinkling lights stopped for a moment. They pulsed as though in time with a failing heart. They dimmed and rested, coming together over the dying old man as though they were a blanket of lights. They settled on his head and his hands and along his body as though to give him some warmth, as though to give him one last breath. The old man's mouth opened, and he sucked in a breath and held it. His eyes were still fixed in bright fascination on the glowing glass image. He let the breath out in one last sigh. His eyes unfocused, and his head fell back. He lay unmoving, with his eyes staring at an unseen God in the unimaginable distance. He was dead. Lee got up and held her hand against his silent heart. She lifted her hand and gently closed her father's eyes. She brushed back his hair and lightly kissed him on his lips. Lee sat in the old chair next to his cot and let the tears run down her face. The image of her mother flickered in imitation of life with the light of the dying embers. The bellows were silent, and the twinkling lights of the little people were gone off to their own far happier homes in the far fields of Fairy. The cold dawn found Lee asleep next to her father. She stood stiffly, wrapping her woolen shawl around her against the morning cold. The fire was dead, and the image of her mother lay dark against the ashes. Lee knew that she had to get the preacher and pay his sons to dig a grave down in the churchyard. They would lay her father down next to her mother, and the preacher would say the comforting words. She took the glass portrait of her mother and leaned it against the stones of the fireplace. It burned her hands when she touched it. The heat in the glass had not yet dissipated. Lee went to the door. She took one look back and blew a farewell kiss. It was directed to the perfect image of her mother as much as to her father. He looked like he was sleeping with her mother watching over him. She opened the door and the chill air made her shiver. As she walked out of the room, a quick wind blew into the workshop, waving the curtains and causing the ashes in the hearth to blow up the chimney in twirling rags of gray. Lee heard a crack and then another. She turned in time to see that the cold air on the hot glass had caused it to shatter. The pieces fell onto the stone hearth, scattering into a million pieces among the fine gray oak ashes. She ran to save what she could. But as she sifted through the warm ashes, she found nothing bigger than a sliver. She moved her fingers through the fragments, sifting for something to keep, but all she found was one piece, the size of a small coin. Cleaning it on a corner of her skirt, she looked at it and then held it up to the morning light. All that remained of all of her father's life and dreams was one small piece of glass. All that remained was one small piece of the perfect gold.